So how many megapixels do you need to be happy? Today we're going to look at 3 images. First image is generated by a Fuji GFX S50 II. It's a 50 megapixel camera with a 35 to 70 kit lens. Then we're going to look at an image made using pixel shift. Pixel shift technology is really interesting. It's taking 16 different images using the IBIS to move the sensor, and then those 16 images get combined into one DNG file using Fuji's pixel shift generator. Now, nothing can move during these photographs. Leaves blowing in the background, all that kind of stuff won't work. It has to be a really static, really clean image. So I chose my standard barn shot as a test, and we're going to look at how does 50 megapixels compare to 200 megapixels? And do you really need 200 megapixels? I wanted to post this graphic just very quickly and show just how big of file sizes we're talking about. You know, at 50 megapixels, you're talking a 275 megabyte 16-bit RGB file. But when you start getting 200 and 400 megapixel images, you're talking 1.14 and 2.28 gigabytes per image. So you can imagine very quickly how much storage you're going to need to properly archive working at these super high megapixels. And so the third thing that we're going to look at is what happens if I just take that 50 megapixels and I run it through some really good interpolation software. I'm using stuff by Topaz, and how do those compare side to side? And what are the pros and cons of both of these techniques? And what are the applications that maybe make sense for both of these techniques? So I got all the images processed. Let's run into the studio and we'll see what we think. All right, so the first image I brought up is the standard 50 megapixel capture. Once again, this is with the 35 to 70 quote unquote kit lens. And we focused the camera directly on the air raid shelter sign. You know, everything in the image has a really wonderful dynamic range. You know, the deep shadows to the controlled highlights, the color, everything, it's really quite pleasing. And I'm really impressed with how nice the 50 megapixel capture is. If we zoom in on the sign, you can see that there's wonderful detail, wonderful texture. Nothing is clipped. I'll get into that in my conclusion. But it really is a really clean, really impressive 50 megapixel image. So now we're taking a look at the 50 megapixel camera, but doing the pixel shift. So this is a 200 megapixel capture. And it looks really great. I mean, it's really clean. I do think there was a little bit more dynamic range, especially in the deep shadows with the 200 megapixel. I think that the sharpness, the clarity, the tonality, the color, everything was lovely. You do get a slightly bigger image size. I noticed that you get a little bit more in the frame, which was kind of nice. That makes sense. And when we zoom into the sign, you know, is it better? Yeah, I mean, there's definitely more information, but I don't think it's like radically better. I think it provides more information, definitely provides more detail, but you know, I'm not quite 100% sure that I like this better than an interpolated image. Let me show you that now. All right, so here we now are looking at the 50 megapixel capture, once again using Topaz Gigapixel AI interpolation software to make it the same file size as the multi-16 shot pixel shift. And I think it looks phenomenal. It's really clean, really sharp. The interpolation software did an incredibly good job. And now if we zoom in once again to the sign, it looks really clean and really good. Let's do a comparison now where we see all three. So now let's take a look at the 3 images side by side. The image on the left is the single 50 megapixel capture. The image in the middle is the single 50 megapixel capture that has been interpolated to the same file size as the multi-shot image. And the image on the right, multi-shot, once again put together in Fuji software and then brought into Photoshop as a DNG. And what I think is interesting is that to my eye, the single shot and especially the interpolated shot have a little bit better quality. Let's take a look at it zooming in even more. At this point, we're really pixel peeping. You know, I'm not a huge fan of that, but we are taking a look at what resolution is possible. Once again, this was with the 35 to 70 kit lens. I know there are sharper lenses available for this camera. Once again, though, if we look at the three images, the image on the left, of course, being the 50 megapixel, it's really good, but when compared to the image in the middle, which is the 50 megapixel with the topaz interpolation, I think that has a little bit more bite. The interpolation is keeping that edge sharpness just a little bit more. And we will look at the 16-shot multi-image on the far right. It's really good and clean, but I don't like it as much as the center image with the interpolation, at least not at this level of pixel peeping. All right, so in conclusion, I think that the Fuji pixel shift technology is interesting, but it's not really for me. I've used focus stacking techniques and other things in the past, and I always find it just to be a little too fussy for my personal working style. I think that interpolation software has gotten so good in the last decade that I would rather say get the cleanest, best file that you can with the best glass that you can, and then interpolate from there. I don't think you really need 200 or 400 megapixels on a capture. A good 50, a good 25, depending on what your work is and depending on what you're printing on and the scale that you're gonna print at. Heck, I work a lot of times with 3 and 4 megapixel images, depending on what I'm going for. So I think that's one of the most important things. Don't be sold down the path that you have to have 100 megapixel, 200 megapixels. It really depends on your working style. And again, I think the interpolation software is so good, I would rather focus on a quality, smaller image and then interpolate it to what I need. Now, one place where I do think this technology is interesting is potentially for digitizing your negatives. I have friends who use the 100 megapixel camera with great success digitizing their black and white film, and they'd like to use the pixel shift technology mainly because the shift causes the grain of the film to slightly blur so it doesn't over accentuate it, yet they get all the crispness and all that dynamic range and all that sharpness that you saw in the image. So one other thing I wanted to talk about was the Fuji Histogram. I don't know if I 100% trust it because the white sign that was in this image, much like the white license plates that were in my previous post on the 100 megapixel cameras, were not clipped in any way, shape, or form on that histogram. Yet, when we brought it into the raw editing software, it was. And we actually went back and had to reshoot it and bring it back even more from that right side to make sure that it wouldn't clip and that we'd have that wonderful textural detail. So I'm not sure if that's something in a Fuji firmware or what, but we've noticed it now on both cameras, the 50 and 100 megapixel camera, that if you're shooting something that's really bright and white, you need to pull it back more than what the histogram is stating, because otherwise you're not going to have the textural detail. So thank you very much for listening. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now go shoot some film.